Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stefan Kritz, Executive Director of CSR Europe, and I'm happy to welcome you at this last day of the European SDG Summit. But this session is of key importance for us. Resilient and inclusive supply chains are, as COVID has emphasized, of key importance to all of us. First of all, for the men and women in our value chains, working in our value chains. For the climate, for the environmental impact of our products and services, for the communities around our business, and therefore, for all these reasons, for the long-term business viability. And personally, I believe that the engagement towards sustainable supply chains and collaboration within supply chain and between different value chains has the greatest potential to really make a contribution to the climate targets and the SDGs. But that is also hard to do. Over the past years, the issue of sustainable supply chain was very high on the agenda of policymakers and stakeholders. We witnessed a strong movement towards more transparency, accountability, due diligence, making level playing fields possible, etc. And also companies made major steps over the past years. And with CSR Europe, we were privileged to be able to witness and also to support this movement in individual companies, but also in entire sectors like the automotive sector, energy, electronics, or chemical sector. And in the discussion with stakeholders, and based on the experience we have developed, a rather strong stance on what is needed to make with due diligence a positive impact and change possible. And we already outlined on the slide 3 important elements for that. We need to have deeper understanding of the effects of our measures. We will need to engage much more in local dialogue on the ground and also with respect for the diversity of voices. And we need to make practical collaboration at scale with all stakeholders. That will make the impact and the change, not as such the self-assessment questionnaires or the audits. They are very important, but they will not make the change as such. It's about livelihood and it's about people. And it's that change we want to make also through our work in value chains and supply chains. And as mentioned, and you will see that on the next slide, with our experience from the automotive sector, we have developed that experience, and it started also Drive Sustainability, which is, and you see the logos of the participating car makers and truck makers. It started as a kind of traditional due diligence exercise, making common guidelines and principles to tier 1 suppliers, mainly setting the expectation, sharing of assessment tools, common data platforms, shared capacity building at the global level, mainly for tier 1 suppliers. So that is fairly a kind of traditional way on due diligence and a necessary, and the scale of it is already a great improvement. For example, suppliers do not face anymore 11 different questionnaires, but there's only one questionnaire that is shared also, so it's more cost efficient. But gradually in the work with the group, and I think I must pay tribute to the people in purchasing divisions of the different companies that are in Drive Sustainability, because they work together in a very intensive way and meet, I think, 4 times a year at least, physically before COVID at least. But gradually the understanding grew that we need to go beyond, and specifically on the topic of raw materials. And yesterday, and that you see on the slide, and it will also be on the discussion and on the resource parts of the platform that we provide, we launched the Raw Material Outlook, which is again a common exercise of the automotive industry on how can we assess the risk related to specific raw materials? How can we understand the supply chain and the value chain better? And not only through desk research, but also through engagement with stakeholders to get a good grip on how does that value chain look like, where is the risk, how can we prioritize it, and then the most important one, how can we engage and dialogue and take action with those specific sectors, be it rubber or cobalt or tin or lithium, whatever, what kind of action is possible. And it's this sphere of engagement that I would like to give as an introduction to this engagement and commitment that is important to drive to make that due diligence will lead also to impact and change. And it's also with that spirit that we compiled the agenda for today. And I'm really honored and privileged to have this panel here today. I will not go through the agenda in detail. We first will see, because Commissioner Reinders is for the moment in the US, but he provided us a specific video for this event. And then we will have a keynote speech from Mr. Takis from the Entreprise Générale du Cobalt in Congo, Kolwezi, who will give his view and the view from a producer side. And then Jan Notre-Dame will take over for a panel discussion with a number of panelists, etc. And in the end, Olivier de Schutter, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, and Koen Doens, the Director General of the Commission International Partnerships, will close this session. So that's for my introduction. On the slide, you see how you can engage with this session as well, using the live discussion function that is below on your screen, where you can find a window will pop up. You can ask questions, you can connect to the speakers through the speakers and networking buttons on it. And also you can look on the materials that CSR Europe has already in place on this, including the different reflection papers on due diligence you can find in the CSR Europe toolbox. And without further ado, and it's really a pleasure for me to have the video from Commissioner Reinders, Commissioner for Justice in the European Commission, who will talk about this project of due diligence. Thank you very much for being with us.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames, messieurs, je voudrais tout d'abord remercier Monsieur le Vicomte Étienne d'Avignon, cher Stevie, de m'avoir invité à prendre la parole ce jour. Je tiens surtout à vous féliciter à l'occasion du 25e anniversaire de CSR Europe. Happy birthday. The historical ties between CSR Europe and the European Union are strong, and they remain strong today. It is not only on the files under my portfolio that we have the pleasure of working with you. I know you have been very busy with my colleagues working on the Green Deal, which is a major priority of the European Commission. So thank you for your consistent engagement, a real European engagement under the leadership of your president, Stevie d'Avignon. Last year, I addressed the CSR Europe conference when we launched the European Pact for Sustainable Industry. I also introduced the work that we are doing on the Initiative on Sustainable Corporate Governance. We are still working on this important initiative with the intention to finalize it by this autumn. Our aim is to reach our overarching sustainability objectives, including embedding environment and human rights in the value chains. The Commission wants to come with a strong proposal of sustainable corporate governance based on the experience gained in the context of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The aim of the proposal is to foster sustainability in corporate decision-making and help companies become environmentally and socially more sustainable. To achieve these goals, we are working on a mandatory due diligence duty. This would enable companies to identify and mitigate risks of adverse impacts in their own operations and value chains. In addition, we are clarifying the duty of directors vis-à-vis the companies. This will lead directors to focus more on the long-term value creation. It will also lead them to design a sustainability strategy for their company and manage sustainability risks. We are also looking into how a future due diligence duty could be aligned with internationally recognized human rights and labor standards and/or international environmental commitments. The initiative will also contribute to the achievement of EU goals such as the 2050 climate neutrality objective and the EU's biodiversity goals. To effectively enforce the rules, we are looking at supervision by administrative authorities and, where needed, civil law remedies. I know you are impatient to see the proposal, but it is important we get this right rather than getting it out fast. We want to take into account all the contributions from stakeholders such as CSR Europe. We also had almost 500,000 responses to the open public consultation. At the same time, and I know this is close to CSR Europe's heart, it is important that we put this into the bigger picture. Legislation alone is one piece of the puzzle. To achieve meaningful results on the ground, what is also required are strong accompanying measures. Compliance needs to go hand in hand with practical collaboration to have a real impact on local ecosystems. We are looking into how best to support this effort. Again, happy birthday to CSR Europe. Keep doing what you are doing. I hope I will be back next year in person. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to the Commissioner and to his services for this kind words and also outlining, and I think it's an important message that he gave about the collaborative efforts. And that's why, Mr. Takis, we are so glad that you are with us today. As you know and heard from Mr. Reiners, there's an increase in Europe and a debate on supply chain sustainability and legislation, but he also said, and that is something that is indeed close to CSR Europe's heart, legislation is not enough, and he emphasized the collaborative efforts that are needed. And that's why we are so honored and privileged to have you as a second keynote on this topic, because you will look at it from a different angle. You are the CEO from EGC, Entreprise Générale du Cobalt, a subsidiary of Gécamines, established in 2019 to oversee the sourcing of cobalt from artisanal mining in the DRC. And with this company, the DRC aims to improve working conditions and increase the income from artisanal mining and enhance traceability. So we would like to hear more about this from you, but also to hear from you, from your perspective, what are your expectations towards the EU, towards this due diligence law, and towards collaboration? Mr. Takis, thank you again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kretz. Thank you for this introduction and remarks on EGC. As you just mentioned, EGC was created to deal with artisanal and small-scale mining in the DRC, specifically in the Lualaba region and Haut-Katanga, where all the artisanal cobalt is produced. But first, let me start my remarks by giving some quick facts about the cobalt ecosystem in the DRC. First, as most of you know, DRC has more than 60% of the world cobalt reserves. And in 2020, last year, DRC produced 95,000 tons of cobalt, which represents almost 70% of the world production. This is to say that in regard to cobalt, DRC is a key player. DRC is a key player as cobalt is a key element of the energy transition, especially when you look at the electric vehicle market growth. Cobalt is a key element in the batteries that drive those cars. The demand will double in the next 10 years, and the market should, in fact, be in a deficit within the next 3 to 4 years. As of today, no substitute has been found for cobalt. So cobalt, let me say it again, is a key element of the energy transition. Of this production, the world production, around 140,000 tons of cobalt in 2020, It is estimated that 10 to 20% of the world production is artisanally mined, which is a huge number. This production is done through the hands of 200,000 diggers, and the estimation goes as up as 250,000 diggers, miners engaged in the production of artisanal cobalt. And when I say 200,000, we can say that this figure is only concentrated in the Lualaba region. So you can see the large number of people that depend on this sector. When I say the large people that depend, we can estimate, if you have 200,000 diggers, that more than 1 million people depend on this sector for their livelihood. It is very important, and Mr. Renders, Commissioner Renders, mentioned, I was pleased to hear, and from you also, the remarks on the livelihood of the people that are engaged in this difficult work. Of course, the sad side of the story is that most of those diggers work without protective equipment, and of course they are facing risks such as health issues in unsafe and insecure working conditions. Even though we still have to resolve issues regarding child labor and vulnerable people working on those sites, disengaging from this sector is not a sustainable solution. To our side, the way we see it, disengaging from this sector will only increase the poverty and precarity in which our communities are living and cause eventual social disruptions. It is therefore essential to support the ASM sector in ensuring that our supply chain is ethical, responsible, and sustainable. Now, talking to the EU policymakers, okay, what do we expect from them? It can be as simple as asking them, how can you help us achieve this goal? We feel that regulation is, of course, of prime importance, but it needs to develop policies that will resolve the root causes of the risk associated with ASM and mainly contribute to the sustainable development of our communities. So those policies as to tackle corruption, to reduce fraud, those policies as to help us and engage in removing children from mining sites, but without impacting the livelihood of their families. Because behind all regulations concerning artisanal mining, especially on our side, cobalt mining, we have people living out of it and making a livelihood out of this harsh work. And then, and not least, these policies protect the environment, the ecosystem in which those communities and those diggers, miners are working to extract cobalt from the ground. Finally, we want to make sure, we would like the EU policymaker make sure that regulations avoid to leave loopholes or help develop secondary trading networks. I say that because what we have observed in the 3 TGs is that loopholes may be due to the difficulty to harmonize regulations throughout European countries is an issue of importance. What do we do on our side? EGC was created by a decree of the government. It is an initiative of the government of the DRC to respond to all the issues above mentioned. EGC has a monopoly. It has been empowered with a monopoly to sourcing the cobalt from artisanal operations. But also, the mandate that we have is to ensure that this production meets high standards of social, environmental responsibility, and traceability. EGC is willing to work with all stakeholders to support local communities by implementing concrete actions that will facilitate their sustainable development. Our business model has specifically reserved a portion of our revenues to do so. As you should maybe know, EGC has developed its own set of responsible sourcing standards, and they were published last March. They were developed by and for the DRC, and they were based on the OECD, of course, on the OECD guide on due diligence. Those standards for us are applicable to all participants in the supply chain, being diggers, cooperative, EGC, and also the final buyers. Finally, we talked about collaboration. I want to end up talking about the collaboration, potential collaboration that we can have. And I'm going to stick at, as of now, on two of them. One, of course, is the collaborative partnership with industry federations. This, in order to bring clarity on the acceptable standards through responsible norms. It is important that we come all together in the industry so that the message to the downstream stakeholders, okay, is clear on what is expected of responsible sourcing. And the other one is to engage with large-scale mining. The industrial has a big role also to play. And actually, we've seen that we've been having more and more contact with large-scale mining entities because they face difficulties themselves related to artisanal miners illegally present on their sites. And EGC has a mandate to formalize that activity and clean the value chain. So we are looking forward to engage with all stakeholders and all people willing to engage in making a better environment for the communities of the artisanal diggers. I want to thank you again for inviting us. It is an honor for EGC to be able to present itself to your local followers and community. Thank you very much.
Mr. Takis, thank you from our side. This was really a pleasure to hear you, and I retain as main points about collaboration also with industry federations, you said, and that is something that is also close to the work that CSR Europe is doing, where we try to also engage here in Europe the industry federations on that sustainability agenda. So that's a promising path, we think. And also you mentioned the importance of collaboration in the local actions, and there I think you also have an expectation towards the downstream companies, but maybe also towards the policy makers to see how we can make that better possible. And then you mentioned also the engagement with the large-scale mining, which is indeed an important way to tackle the root causes that you mentioned. I thank you for your contribution. We can talk long about this, and I would like to talk long about this, but I will give the floor now to Jan Otterdalen, who is our Senior Advisor External Affairs, and he will introduce the panel discussion. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan, and I hope that my voice comes over well. Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm happy to take over to moderate now the panel. Then later I will introduce our two last distinguished guests, Olivier de Scuter and Koen Doens. In exactly 55 days, on the 8th of December, that's the date now that we have received for the European Commission to release its long-awaited proposal for an EU regulation on due diligence, and that will make enterprises liable, and which to, and I quote Didier Reynders, to achieve meaningful result needs also to be accompanied by strong measures. So we have 55 days left, and I think it's a collective responsibility for all of us to support, and the Commission, but also later the Council and the Parliament, to equip Europe with a holistic and integrated policy and action plan on due diligence that will put the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into practice, and as it was mentioned also by Mr. Takis, in the daily livelihoods, was it of his 200,000 diggers, but also the millions of other workers, farmers, and miners. So a holistic and integrated strategy at European or EU level, yes. At industry federations level, yes. And of course, at enterprise level, for sure. First, we will listen to Kerstin Jorna. She is the Director General of DG GROW. And the reason was very simple. We know since a couple of weeks or a few months now that Didier Reynders, which we listened to, will now be in the co-lead together with Commissioner Breton, who is heading DG GROW, to co-lead this European proposal on sustainable corporate governance and on due diligence. So let's first listen to Kerstin, and then I will come back to the panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear CSR members, happy birthday. 25 years of engagement for sustainability challenges. That's a great work and a great inspiration for all of us. Sustainability is also at the heart of the work that we are doing at the European Commission. We're taking initiatives in a very broad range, and probably you're discussing all of them today. For example, about mobilizing investment, sustainable investment, through the Sustainable Finance Strategy. The new industrial strategy and the update that we presented last May 2021 sets out the broad framework and the shared ambition to accelerate the green and digital transition and strengthen the single market and build a system that's more resilient to future shocks. If you want the summary of our strategy, updated strategy in 3 words, it's about the business case. We want to support our industrial ecosystems to grasp new business opportunities in Europe and abroad. But now it's time to walk the talk. We are working on transition pathways for the 14 industrial ecosystems. We want to engage all actors, and that means industry, startups, SMEs, training facilities, trade unions and worker representations, universities. We need everybody on board to understand how a given ecosystem can best meet this triple challenge: resilience, green, and digital by 2030. Also, what inspires us is a number of lessons that we learned from the pandemic. I'd like to mention 3 here. The first lesson is that we need to strengthen the resilience of our single market, especially in times of crisis. This is why the Commission is working on a proposal for a single market emergency instrument, and which we hope to present in 2022. Second lesson is that we need to understand better our dependencies and their consequences. We learned it from vaccines, but if we look now, we see many more dependencies in areas that are critical for our health, our security, or our green and digital transition. Microprocessors may be the talk of town today. Tomorrow it may be permanent magnets or raw materials. We need to build sustainable and resilient supply chains. That's not a luxury. Third, we need to build this business case for the transformation. And that means that we need to look at coherent and stable regulatory frameworks. It means that we need to look at demand, not only supply, of green and circular products. It means that we need to look at access to investment and finance to finance this transition. We need to look at secure supply chains, and we need to look at abundant and affordable energy. And of course, we need to look at the right skills. I would like to thank the work of the CSR Europe in support of our industrial strategy. I welcome the first Sustainable Industry Barometer and also this Pact for Sustainable Industry. Let me now turn to responsible business behavior, which is one part of this equation. Commissioner Breton and Commissioner Reinders are preparing a proposal on sustainable corporate governance, and you already heard a number of details on this from Commissioner Reinders. Dear CSR members, in conclusion, it's about the sustainable business case that we have to build, and we have to build every day. I count on your collaboration. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, for this message, and we are really looking forward to pursue the dialogue and collaboration with your teams in DG Grow, but also with, of course, DG Justice, DG INPA for international partnerships, but also trade and the external relations, so that we can really ensure that the EU will set in place also these practical measures to support the sustainable supply chain initiatives, but also these collective actions that were already mentioned. Now, I would like to put two questions to Renata Jungo-Brünger. She's member of the management board of Daimler, but also of Mercedes-Benz. And the question was pre-recorded, but I will put it live today, and we will listen to her response through a video. So, Renata, with the thousands of direct, but also the thousands of indirect suppliers of Daimler, what is your ambition as a company? What is your action plan also to embed human rights and environment into your value chains?
I like drinking coffee, and I like driving my car. Personally, I want both my coffee and my car produced under the full respect of human rights. This personal matter is fully in line with Daimler's sustainable business strategy. We want that people who contribute to producing our cars are as safe as our passengers. That is why we deep dive into our highly complex supply chains. That is why we implemented our so-called human rights respect system. And we are sending quality engineers for audits on-site at market with risks. And finally, that is why we have linked our ambitious targets to our company bonus schemes for managers. From the very first, we at Daimler are firmly committed to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The target is clear. We only want vehicles produced without any violations of human rights. With our human rights respect system, we identify and tackle potential human rights risks at own entities and in our global supply chains. Because our supply chains are highly complex, we have to do that in a systematic, risk-based way. With over 60,000 direct suppliers and their numerous sub-suppliers, our supply chains are more likely supply networks. Thus, we have identified 24 potentially risky raw materials, which we examine further. Regulations should take the complexities of supply chains into account. We support the German due diligence law. It is very ambitious, but still takes into account the realities companies are confronted with. Certainly, there are aspects of the law that leave room for improvement. But what matters most is that the law will help improve the situation of people on the ground. Now, it is important to have one set of rules instead of a patchwork of 27 national regulations. In this respect, we welcome an EU regulatory framework if it generally meets 3 criteria. It is feasible, it creates a level playing field, and it helps the people on the ground. With an ambitious but implementable approach, things can be improved. Impractical requirements, however, may lead companies to retreat from critical countries in order to reduce their legal risks. We are convinced the right approach for the people on the ground is the principle of empowerment before retreat. I am excited to hear about the draft EU regulation in a few days. In any case, we will further strengthen our activities for sustainability and human rights.
Thank you, Renata, for that. And it was already mentioned earlier that collaboration is indeed essential if we want to bring change to these local ecosystems. Is it to address the root causes of poverty, which was mentioned by Takis? Is it to diversify the economic and job opportunities, especially in regions where extraction is a monopoly? Is it to accelerate the education reforms to bring kids back to school or in vet? So what are some of the collective actions that Daimler is engaging in?
We build cars. We build cars for people, with people. That's why we want to respect human rights and to create added value for the people on the ground. To achieve that, we need partners like politics, NGOs, the scientific community, and we need you. Human rights and environmental due diligence in complex supply chains can only be successful when we cooperate. Complex challenges require collective action. We at Daimler are engaged in different collective action initiatives within and beyond the automotive industry. With the Responsible Lithium Partnership, we initiated a partnership together with other companies, coordinated by the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, called GIS. The partnership seeks to connect all local stakeholders, including indigenous communities, in a joint vision for the Salar de Atacama in Chile. The GIS also plays its part in coordinating the German automotive branch dialogue together with the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Within this platform, we aim to find joint solutions to common challenges the industry is facing when it comes to protecting human rights. Amongst others, we are piloting a joint grievance mechanism to complement our internal complaints procedures. Last but not least, we actively participate in the Drive Sustainability Initiative. Its raw materials outlook, which has been launched just recently during the SDG Summit, is built around an in-depth analysis of raw material supply chains. It helps us to better understand human rights and environmental risks and to define tailored measures. All these initiatives strive to make supply chains more transparent and more resilient to risks that we all share. We will only be able to manage this together, and that is where we need to stand together. Let's further cooperate. I am looking forward to it.
Thank you, Renata. And what I take note of is this human rights respect system within Daimler, also a bonus scheme for managers, asking also for a EU regulation that creates a level playing field, but also, it's your words, that can improve the situation of people on the ground. And then also you make it clear examples of how you collaborate with others. And then your last words, empowerment and not retreat, or before retreat. So this brings me to Heske. Heske, you are the managing director of Solidaridad Europe. Last year, your chairperson, Mariam Dao-Gabala, was keen enough to speak at our summit, and she made it very clear. Europe's values and standards alone do not impact the livelihoods of farmers and workers and miners. Solidaridad is also close to. So what more, Heske, is needed, and what would be your ambition for the future proposal of the European Commission for a regulation and strong accompanying measure? Heske?
Jan, thank you. And allow me to also say happy birthday, because it's your birthday, I understand. So happy birthday to you and all your colleagues. And thanks for having me. Yeah, there's really something at stake, I would say, here, because I heard some very nice things already during this interesting conference. But it's all about the people at the beginning of our supply chains. And in my opinion, this is really what is at stake. We want impact for people who produce our food, our coffee, our tea, the minerals in our phones, in our batteries, our clothes. It's about the livelihoods of the smallholder farmers, the miners, and the workers at the beginning of our supply chains. And the real purpose of this European Union due diligence legislation is to improve the livelihoods of those people in producing countries at the beginning of our European supply chains and to decrease our European footprint. And that's why it's so very, very important to take a southern perspective and to really take the interest of producers into account. Because sustainability should be the norm. And we as Solidaridad, working with farmers and workers on a daily basis all around the world, are a big supporter of mandatory frameworks. However, by designing these regulatory frameworks, we should really ensure that the southern perspective is taken into account and we will have the desired effect. Just like Renata said, it should help people on the ground. That's what we want. And we know that the reality on the ground is harsh, with persistent poverty being endemic. So the mandatory due diligence, as it's designed now, also brings risks. So living up to and monitoring the EU requirements will come with an extra burden, an extra cost. And there is a big risk that the reporting burden and those extra costs will be passed to the weakest shoulders in the chain, those farmers and workers. And at Solidaridad, because we work with those farmers and workers every day, we see that is the case already with certification schemes, for example. So suppliers are really squeezed between conflicting demands to deliver at a low price on the one hand, and to uphold the demanding standards subject to monitoring on the other hand. And sometimes it's even deteriorating their livelihoods. So another severe risk, which Renata also was referring to already, is that companies will disengage and avoid procuring from suppliers in high-risk countries. Because, for example, smallholder farmers will become a liability for companies, since they bring the risk of child labor, deforestation. And that is something we should avoid. So it's very important to mitigate those risks and to ensure an inclusive approach that does not exclude, as well as making sure there's a business case for industry in Europe, for sure, but also for the producers at the beginning of the chain. Sustainability is not a free ride. So we need due diligence regulation that is inclusive, fit for purpose, and we need accompanying measures. And that brings me also to another thing that is at stake, in my opinion, and that's the economic model of our industry partners. So manager due diligence is the first step, but we should strive to adopt really inclusive business models. I've read that an ambition of the industry pact that many of the panelists, but also in the audience, signed, is mainstream sustainability as a business model. And that is music to my ears, because our economic model has to change. Our current model is one of exploitation and it's exhausting our planet. So it also means that companies have a clear responsibility beyond compliance. They must work not only to tick the boxes, but really engage with their suppliers to address the root cause of the problems. Poverty, for example, is an important root cause. Corruption was also mentioned before. So we have to reward sustainable practices. We have to reward living incomes, because sustainability is not a free ride. And purchasing practices should be geared to support sustainable behavior. So we must really raise the awareness that living wage, living income are very important prerequisites. If we still have poor producers, we will continue to face severe issues such as child labor and deforestation, because there's so much intertwined. So concluding, what do we need to ensure a truly positive impact? How to ensure the industry will really engage with their suppliers? So I think part of this due diligence legislation should be really the duty to collaborate. And that's why I would like to take the opportunity to call on everyone here to work together, to really prioritize adding this fourth pillar to the UN guiding principles, the duty to collaborate, to engage, in addition to these three present pillars: duty to respect, duty to protect, a duty for remedy. So a duty to collaborate is needed to make due diligence work, but it's not enough. And that's why I'm very happy that I heard also Mr. Reiner say that accompanying measures to make a positive impact are essential. So yes, please a call for Mr. Reiners, but also Mr. Doens, who is speaking later. Please be equally ambitious to design these accompanying measures. Producer countries are an important stakeholder and should be involved as well.
Thank you. This was a strong plea, and that is, I think, also very much reinforcing the kind of plea that we are also making towards the EU leaders. Thank you very much. I might come later back to you, Heske, with regard to this risk of enterprises tempted to disengage or to retreat from critical countries. But before, I would like to test also what you mentioned as the need for inclusive economic and inclusive business models. So that is a bridge to Eva Benis. You are Director of Responsible Purchase at Volvo Group. So the question to you is almost set by Heske. Is Volvo on a journey to transform its business model into a inclusive business model? And the question to you also with regard to your function, where do you see most the difficulties for transforming the function of purchase, which is critical I would say, I hope, hand in hand with the sustainability officer and the other ones. But how do you see currently the situation, also building on your experience? Eva.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Eva Bennis, and I represent the Volvo Group. And as many, inclusive and responsible companies today, of course, we are really on this journey to create prosperous, inclusive societies, and we have such a big impact here in the Volvo Group on driving these challenges, of course, and to tackle them. And I really liked what you said, Heske, about creating this fourth pillar, the duty to collaborate. I will take that with me. I really like that. But yes, you asked me about our top 3 challenges, and I think some of them have already been touched upon. And yes, we are in the automotive industry. We are producing commercial vehicles such as trucks, buses, excavators, and so forth. And it is one of the biggest pain points for us in order to achieve all these sustainability goals is, of course, the complexity of our supply chains. We have almost 50,000 direct suppliers, as Daimler Group, similar structure, and sometimes there can be up to 10 tiers from the raw material extraction until we assemble the part into our final products. You can do the math yourself in the complexity of this. And some of them only deliver quite few parts to us because it might be custom adaptation parts or something. These are sometimes, so really managing the complexity of this is, of course, a really big problem and really makes it difficult how to handle all of that. And then the question is should everyone tackle every problem? Should you allocate your work towards more on a risk assessment? And that's, of course, the question, I think the $1 million question, where is it even possible to tackle everything, or should you do a proper risk assessment in that sense? But in this, another challenge there is in this complexity is then, of course, to create the transparency and the trust. We see, of course, creating transparency is really about having trust. If you don't have trust, you will never create transparency. If I want to know what is happening on a smelter level, which is maybe tier 4 or 5, and we do not have any direct businesses with those in the smelter level and any raw material. We are dependent on having a trustful relationship with the tiers downstream with our more direct suppliers, and that might seem as quite obvious, but having that then on the tier 2, 3 level and all these hundreds of thousands of companies it is not something that you create overnight, and that is, of course, a challenge that we have and that we need to address, and everyone must address it. That without the trust and without you will not achieve the collaboration. Another problem and complexity that we have is to see the whole picture. I think I don't remember exactly who said it, but it's I think it was Heske. You try to tackle one problem. For example, you come up with a certification model and you say, yippee-ki-yay, we solved the problem, we have a certificate. But then it actually creates other problems by you lift another stone. So really trying to take responsible decisions which are really on a big picture level, truly responsible and sustainable is of course a challenge for us, and is something we're trying to tackle every day. Just look at our journey towards renewable energy. We are, of course, for ourselves in our group, but also for our supply chain partners, on a journey to transition towards renewable energy, becoming a fossil-free. But of course, if you invest in renewable energy, where the wind farms were constructed on land that was taken from indigenous people without prior consent, did we create a sustainable solution? No, we did not. And that, so always looking at the complete picture is something that requires knowledge. It requires that you have access to data and that you have access to educated people, both my colleagues in purchasing, but also, of course, with our supply chain as partners. So that is, I think, and then last but not least, one really important challenge for us, which we're trying to tackle, is the cultural aspects, of course. When we come as a Western company and put our nice supplier code of conduct on the table and saying you may not work excessive working hours, but then you come to a situation where it's very, where the cultural setting is, of course, very different reasons allowing those types of behaviors. I'm not saying that we then accept it, but trying to accommodate these aspects is really something as a big pain point for us that we're trying to achieve then with various things like for the trust or the transparency of the corporation, etc.
Thank you, Eva, for that. And listening to you and what you just mentioned about this cultural element, and that is something that CSR Europe, together with GIZ and other partners, we try to address by making sure that we are at our best in supporting local ground level networks, and where you invest indeed in that and you capitalize on local intelligence, reinforcing the capacity buildings for these local networks, then to pursue in the longer term the efforts with regard enhancing these livelihoods. I think that is a critical element. If we don't do this through a kind of inculturation mindset, we will continue the old way, north, south, sometimes arrogant attitude we have been having. So thank you very much for that input. I would like to maybe ask Mr. Takis maybe to react. There has been a number of elements raised by Heske, also Eva, with regard this extra burden, extra costs, and with the example of certification schemes where you dump it also, I would say, somewhere at the end of the supply chain. There was also the risk of the retreat of companies of certain regions or countries. How do you experience that already in the two provinces in the Republic of Congo? Can you say something about that? And please unmute yourself.
Yes. Yes, many of points that have been raised are of interest to us, including, of course, collaboration, the obligation to collaborate, which we feel it is very important if we want to tackle most of the issues that we are facing in the artisanal sectors. And if we want to reach out to the local communities, it is, of course, important. The complexity of issues indicates that no one can tackle those issues alone. It is a collaborative endeavor that will help us get through all cultural and the reality of the livelihood of people that are in this artisanal work in the cobalt industry in DRC. But of course, the question is, as I guess it was mentioned, when you talk about the due diligence, the norms, when you go through, we have to understand that an artisanal digger, we cannot put that responsibility on himself. The artisanal diggers, if you tell an artisanal digger you have to do this way, that way, doesn't mean anything to him. The thing that means something to him is the food that he can put on the table for his family. So there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that people are aware that all of these is in their benefit at the end of the day, in the benefit of their family, and also to make sure that they are still engaged on the market. Their production is still on the market. So the problem of, as I heard, the problem of people disengaging, wanting to disengage, okay, as I said before, it is not a sustainable solution, because either way, this cobalt will end up in the automotive or the industry through different networks. So as we said today, there are maybe 15 to 20,000 tons of cobalt produced by artisanal workers. Okay, this cobalt is somewhere. Even though we've heard that people don't want to buy any more of cobalt, sourced artisanal cobalt from ASM, with what we've seen with the children in those mines and things that nobody will support and allow. But the production of this artisanal production has to be getting somewhere through some kind of network. So it won't go away by just saying we disengage. People will suffer more, and some people will take advantage of that situation. So the better way to approach it is what we've seen. Also, we've seen Guy also a lot in the Lualaba region, okay, engaging to further human rights. Ourselves, EGC, we've put, with the help of the NGO Pact, a lot of measures to make sure that human rights are of utmost importance on the sites that we are preparing. So the disengagement is not a solution. And to what we see, we have maybe non-European companies on the ground that find a way to take that production and through secondary networks, have it come back into the main production lines. Without, of course, companies like Daimler, Volvo knowing at the end of the day where all of these cobalt is coming from. So the solution is really to keep engaging and make sure that not disengage, but further collaboration and on-the-ground support of those workers and those families.
Thank you, Takis. I see that there are questions also on the chat function, and I invite all speakers to have a look at it. And as it was mentioned by Stefan, we want to have this summit very interactive through this platform we have from, of course, and using all the functions to connect to each other and maybe also to reply to some of the questions. I want to be in time before introducing Olivier, but maybe I have still a chance to ask Heske and Eva to maybe react to what has been said so far, and maybe to also give it a chance to articulate. Is it in one strong plea or call? We have Olivier, who is very familiar with the United Nations family and system, and then we have also Koen from the Commission. So what would be your call to them now that we still have 55 days before the proposal from the Commission comes out? Heske.
Thank you very much, Jan. Yeah, I think it's very clear that disengagement is not a solution and we should prevent it from happening. And preventing it from happening means that we should include this duty to collaborate and this accompanying measures. So we really have a strong regulatory framework as the European Union, and that we really have a positive impact on these communities we are talking about. And I also am convinced that this duty to collaborate also will help our industry partners, because it makes it much easier to comply with the other duties. And it's really by engaging with their suppliers, the root causes of the problems can be addressed. But we've also heard it's not easy. It's not easy because the supply chains are complex. There are lots of challenges on the ground. So how do we engage? Yeah, how do we ensure that we improve the livelihoods? How do we ensure those people get a fair share in the chain and a fair say as well? So I think they don't need to do it alone, the industry partners. So this is where the EU comes in, but also civil society partners like Solidaridad. So we can help. We can also help to play an important role to help engage with these producers on the ground and to help overcome those challenges which are there in the different supply chains. But also public-private partnerships are very supportive to ensure that smallholders, workers and miners are supported to meet the requirements of the European market. And more important even, to improve their standard of living. And that brings us to this accompanying measures. And well, I would really like to take the opportunity, as you asked me, what's your message towards Mr. Koen-Doens, for example? The EU really needs to step up also to help industry to make this impact with a comprehensive mix of demand and supply side measures, including measures to really involve and support producers. So what the EU should do, and I'll be short but clear, partner with governments in producing countries to discuss what needs to happen to comply with these EU requirements, to jointly develop a roadmap and to implement this roadmap to bridge the gap to the current situation towards really truly sustainable production. And there also should be sufficient funds available because we cannot put all the burden in those producing countries. Then second, in partnership with these producer countries, but also with the industry, there should be financial incentives for smallholders, but also small mines to move towards sustainable practices. So we should ensure that smallholder farmers, for example, have access to affordable loans so they can invest in sustainable production, but also to arrange access for them to international carbon markets so they are paid for their ecosystem services. And then it's very important to facilitate a process between the different stakeholders to develop pricing models to strive for living incomes. And then finally, really supports the European industry to truly mainstream sustainability. We also have seen in the European Sustainable Industry Barometer you published, there is a big difference between frontrunners and laggards. So they can use some help as well to really push for this inclusive business models, and focused funding might be a solution as well there. So I really hope that under the leadership of Koen-Doens, the International Partnership Department will take a very proactive role in designing these accompanying measures, trade agreements, partnership with producing countries, funds to really make the industry able to make a positive impact.
Thank you, Heske. Thank you. And Eva, maybe
Yes.
in a more condensed way. So that we can
I will try to be more condensed. And I mean, collaboration is of course key, and really putting in safe harbor principles, of course, where we can utilize what we do in collaborative actions. Volvo Group is a really proud member of Drive Sustainability, the industry collaboration on supply chain sustainability in the automotive industry, and of course, giving incentives to do that. But I also quickly want to turn it around and turning my word towards you, other listeners here from the industry, if other companies do not only rely on collaborative actions. I said we need to create this through trust, right? Trustworthy dialogues with our supply chain partners, with the entire value chain, can only be done if we sit down together. We use, of course, the knowledge, the data, everything created through collaborative actions, like sitting down and having a very trustful discussion needs to be happening maybe in smaller groups, because there's always, we're all business people who want to keep secrets and, everything like that. So don't also take that responsibility, sit down and really create these trustful dialogues is something I would like to bring to everyone listening here today. Thank you.
Nice.
Great. Thank you very much.
Dialogue.
Thank you, Heske. Thank you very much for all these inputs. And so now time has come for me to introduce the two distinguished guests that we have, starting with Olivier de Scuter. You are the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And I think people might remember you as also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food that was back somewhere 2008, 2014. But you also, in this capacity, have put a lot of dust on your shoes, going on the ground, looking where are the inequalities, but also looking at where are these new generations of solidarity and maybe trust dialogues that Eva was mentioning. So we would be extremely keen to listen to you. We are at 10 years of a kind of celebration of the UN guiding principles that was referred to by, I think, all the speakers. And then Heske has been taking the words out of my mouth, and she's proposing a fourth element in the UN guiding principles, which is this duty to collaborate. Can we have your wise insights about all of that? Olivier?
Well, many thanks, Jan, for this very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here to celebrate your anniversary, but also to join this very distinguished panel. Let me start by saying how important the proposals made by the European Commission in 55 days may be. I think mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence has a potential impact at 5 levels. First, it will certainly contribute to improve legal certainty for businesses. Currently, companies do not know under which conditions they can be held liable for human rights, environmental rights violations in their supply chains under general civil liability rules. They know they can be sued under the Brussels I regulation. They know which law in principle is applicable under the Rome II regulation, but they do not know exactly what is the scope of their duty of care towards the victims. And I think this proposal is important because it shall clarify the legal framework applicable. Secondly, as Renata Juncker-Brünger quite rightly emphasized, this will create a level playing field. All companies selling goods, providing services in the EU market shall have to comply with the same standard set of rules. This hopefully will put an end to what may be seen as unfair competition between companies sourcing their supplies from abroad and companies sourcing locally, companies doing the right thing and companies ignoring the impacts of their sourcing policies on human rights violations. So I think it will create a welcome level playing field. Thirdly, the proposals and the new directive that will hopefully be approved in due course will send a powerful message to the world. Companies seeking to export to the EU or to do business with companies domiciled in the EU should comply with certain international standards. And I think that is the EU being faithful to its values and using, I think rightly, its economic weight in order to make globalization much more humane. And indeed, the fourth impact of this initiative will be that global supply chains will be transformed into a lever for positive change, in fact, humanizing globalization and raising the bar rather than encouraging potentially a race to the bottom. Fifth and finally, I think this is a very important moment because it will really prepare businesses operating in the EU to the 21st century in which brand reputation is a hugely important asset that companies must preserve at all risks. And I think the most important incentive for companies already today to comply with the expectations of buyers and the general public is really that reputation has become such an important concern for businesses in their search for the bottom line. Now, let me maybe emphasize the importance of this last point, and I'd like to share just one moment my screen to show the results of a study on the business case for complying with human rights that was presented a couple of years ago, and that I hope you can see this now, that is titled Good Business, the Economic Case for Protecting Human Rights. And it shows the variety of ways in which complying with human rights in supply chains is actually good for business. It can allow to maintain good community relations. It can allow to mobilize the workforce and motivate it better. It can allow, as regards economic incentives, to qualify for public contracts when these public procurement schemes are made conditional upon complying with human rights. It can encourage socially responsible investment. It can allow to comply with certain requirements increasingly included in trade agreements. It can protect the company from litigation costs that may be extremely costly, not only in terms of the fees lawyers demand, but also in terms of the reputational costs involved if you are sued. And finally, it can prepare companies better for the future, in which, as I said, brand reputation will play an increasingly important role. So I think these are all elements that should convince us that actually what is under preparation is extremely important for companies, and I think a good thing for the healthiness and sustainability of European businesses. How to ensure that these potentially positive impacts of the human rights due diligence mandatory directive shall actually materialize? I think there are two conditions for this to happen. The first condition is that human rights due diligence should not be degraded into a ticking box exercise in which businesses proceed a minima to ensure they comply with the due diligence obligations imposed on them, but are not proactive to move beyond that minimum set of expectations. And indeed, that is why compliance with human rights due diligence should not exclude legal liability where the measures adopted appear to be insufficient. Let me be very clear by taking one example. The French law of 27th of March 2017, which you are all familiar with, is one that imposes on large companies to adopt a plan de vigilance, a due diligence action plan with 5 components. Now, a company could be tempted to simply adopt such a plan, tick the 5 boxes, ensure that this plan is compatible with the requirements of the legislation, and then take a very hands-off approach towards how the supply chain is managed and how their suppliers behave. And that would be problematic because it will not ensure an ongoing effort to improve things and to ensure that all measures are taken that could prevent human rights violations or environmental rights violations from occurring. And so we need to ensure that if the measures adopted are indeed proven to be insufficient, and if indeed a human rights violation does occur, that legal liability may be engaged. In other terms, adopting due diligence plans should not be a guarantee of legal impunity. That is exactly what is in the Treaty on Business and Human Rights, which is currently under negotiation in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. So that's the first condition. The second condition is that we need mandatory human rights, environmental rights due diligence to be combined with enabling strategies that ensure a gradual transformation of global supply chains towards improved sustainability. And that, in my view, requires 3 changes. First, from extractive to inclusive supply chains. Extractive supply chains are supply chains that are organized so that the production process, the segmentation of the production process maximizes profits and minimizes costs, even when this is at the expense of sustainability, and even when this leads, paradoxically, countries to seek to achieve a comparative advantage in the global competition by keeping their populations poor. I remember having been to Malawi, for example, in 2011. This is probably an example Heske Verburg knows very well. And Malawi has a wages restraint policy in place since 1971 that forces employers who want to raise wages to seek an authorization from the government in order to do so. Why? Because Malawi believes its comparative advantage resides in keeping its workers in poverty. That is not acceptable. We need inclusive supply chains, and we can learn in this respect from the fair trade experiment. Why does fair trade work? It works because the loyalty of suppliers is bought from them, minimizing the temptation of side selling and ensuring that the virtual competitors will not be seen as an attractive option for the suppliers. So treating suppliers well is a way to buy loyalty and to ensure that you do not face side selling by suppliers. It means ensuring participation of suppliers in setting the standards, ensuring therefore that small and middle-sized enterprises, small-scale farmers will not be excluded, for example, because of very strong reporting requirements. It means moving away from a cut-and-run strategy to capacity building, imposing a duty to collaborate on businesses so that they support their suppliers in complying with the standards imposed on them. And this means including a time dimension in the gradual process of adaptation to the new regulatory requirements. And as expectations are addressed to the suppliers, to support them in complying. And it means, thirdly and finally, to move beyond what Heske Verburg has rightly described as the conflicting demands imposed on suppliers, who on the one hand have to supply materials or services at the lowest price possible, including by the use of reverse auctioning mechanisms by the buyers, but at the same time, these suppliers who have to provide these goods and services at a low cost should comply with certain standards that may be expensive to comply with. And I think we have to move beyond that sort of schizophrenia which we impose on the suppliers by supporting a design in which the buyer not only ensures the living wage is paid and decent remuneration is guaranteed, but in addition, contributes to the costs of compliance as a means to invest in a long-term relationship. So I believe mandatory human rights and environmental rights due diligence is extremely important, creates very welcome opportunities, and I listed the 5 reasons why I think this indeed is to be welcomed by European businesses in particular, but it does require that we create a framework for those potential positive impacts to be sustainable in time, and that is, I believe, how we can move from extractive to inclusive global supply chains. Many thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Olivier. And I recognize also the professor at Louvain and at Sciences Po with that capacity to structure your narrative. Thank you very much for also that pedagogy that you have been sharing with us. So now time for me to introduce Koen Doens. Now, Koen, I have to be extremely frank with you. Before the speech this morning, at the beginning of this plenary from Didier Reinders, CSR Europe and many, including Solidaridad and many, we were a little bit lost in translation. We were not able to make our case about having a double combined approach of and a smart regulation and strong accompanying measures. And that's why we were very keen to have you not only as the Director General of DG INPA, but also as former professor in Latin. And in French, you know the expression, on est arrivé au bout de notre latin. We were lost in translation. I have not found any better translation, but you are the professor. But so that was to ask you maybe to help us being so lost. So thank you for being with us. I will not go back to your whole CV, but you have also a long tradition of being a diplomat. So handling all these complex issues is, I think, part of your daily skills and capacities. But as Director General of DG INPA, there's a lot of expectations on you, also on DG GROW, but there it's still unclear. But how is it that Europe is going to equip indeed itself with a integrated policy on due diligence, with a smart regulation and accompanying measures? So we are looking forward to listen to you and also maybe to challenge us. What is it that more we can do for the next 50 days to come? Koen.
Well, thanks a lot, Jan, and really a pleasure to be here with you. You've set out a daunting task, because if Didier Reinders got you lost in translation and you're asking me to translate you out of being lost, I'm not sure that I will be able to do so. I mean, what I would maybe want to start with is indeed, I mean, you've announced me as the Director General for the DG International Partnerships. And that name is actually new. Until January of this year, we were still called the DG for Development Cooperation. And that name change, I mean, reflects a very hard reality, which is that in my area of work, development cooperation, as we used to do it, does no longer cut the cake. And that if we look at the global challenges we are all facing, inequality, climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on, if you look at how they roll out across the globe and how they affect everyone in different ways and different degrees, it's very clear that that to work with partner countries, emerging economies, developing countries, lower middle income countries, LDCs, that we need to bring on board the full power and the full complexity, therefore, of the different policy strands that we deploy, that we use, that we harness as an EU. And my DG, as you've rightly said, through this name change, reflects that we engage with all of this in a different way than we did before. And I'll try to illustrate it a bit through my short expose today. Because what obviously, if we take the big picture, a real key priority of this Commission, as you all know, is for Europe to become the world's first climate neutral continent by 2050. And we've set out a very ambitious agenda, and Olivier referred to the Fit for 55 proposal. It drives a whole set of societal, of economic measures that we are putting into place now. It requires decisive action in many areas. Now, obviously, there is a very strong international dimension to all of this. And we're obviously very conscious that as the largest market in the world, when we set these kind of new higher standards in a multiple series of areas, and in this case on human rights and environment, that they do have an impact on our international partners. Now, very important to clarify that the aim, of course, is for other countries and organizations to join us to meet those ambitious objectives. And this is not about shutting people out of the EU market. It's really about ensuring continued access to the EU market, but on higher standards. And therefore, and that's where my Director General plays a role, there is a crucial element that is needed, which is how do we support partners? How do we accompany all of this? Of course, the ambitious package of legislation that we're talking about, and of which the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative is part, is not based on quicksand. I think the decisions are really based on evidence, with all the fitness checks, the impact assessments, and so on. You are all well aware about, and we do measure the impact of the proposed measures on our partner countries. And moreover, there's an angle, of course, of coherence in it, because there is an interlinkage between these various legislative initiatives, which ultimately makes them more impactful. For example, the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative ensures complementarity with initiatives with due diligence reporting requirements, such as the Deforestation Regulation, on which we're working now, Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, and the Sustainable Products Initiative. So if we apply that very concretely, and that's the kind of way we look at it from my department, take a chocolate producer and that directly sources cacao beans from Ghana or Côte d'Ivoire. Obviously, the company would have to follow the due diligence rules pursuant to the deforestation proposal regarding risks associated with deforestation. And so only cacao beans that are harvested on land that has not been subject to deforestation can be placed on the EU market. The company has to follow the due diligence steps under the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, for example, child labor, working conditions, pollution, biodiversity loss. And finally, the company would have to communicate on how adverse impacts are addressed pursuant to the rules of the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. So we see the interlinkages between all these initiatives, and that's crucial because we try to look as much as possible, not just at the single impact of one measure on partner countries, but on the whole complex impact that it has. This means for a DG like mine, that on the one hand, we actively engage, of course, in the preparation of all these legislative proposals, in the assessment of their effect on partner countries, markets, industries. And on the other hand, and the two are, of course, linked, that we design packages of support to help those implemented by our measures to perform and conform according to these new EU standards. Now, I want to share just a few tools that we use for that. First of all, of course, there's money. We now have a new EU external budget. That's good news. It only happens, as you know, once every 7 years, because we work with these multi-annual financial frameworks, but we now have a new one, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, UNDICI, in short, Global Europe, an instrument with a budget of 80 billion euros for the next 7 years. And we've, of course, worked over the past year as we start preparing the programming of this instrument, very much with these big Commission priorities on our mind. And the good news here, I mean, we are landing now the programming period, is that of the planned country programs we have been working on, 66% include supply chain sustainability amongst the priority areas. So, I mean, it's a clear indication of how important we find this work, the need to accompany partners, and how we've put the money where our mouth is. Now, this is further topped up, or this is, I mean, it's not topped up, it's part of the amount is used to provision guarantee funds of our expanded European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, which should leverage more than €500 billion in public and private investments in partner countries, of course, directed at sustainable development and the SDGs. So the whole way in which the leveraging that we can do with our innovative financial instruments works is, of course, in a way that reinforces the impact and the support on helping our partners on this road to sustainability. Secondly, we're developing and promoting sustainable finance in the world's financial systems. We're as you know, the largest issuer of green bonds. We will work over the next few years to develop green bond markets in partner countries. We have our green taxonomy. We're going to adopt a sustainable finance strategy specifically for partner countries. And most importantly, we are working with the private sector to incentivize this kind of long-term engagement of EU companies with suppliers in developing countries. And we there build the capacity of local producers to adopt sustainable production practices and to promote business-friendly operating environments. So if I take an example again, take the mining sector, I mean, the starting point for us is a sustainable extraction of raw materials. I mean, if well managed, is an absolutely indispensable source of national revenue. And we know how much many of our partner countries struggle with proper domestic resource mobilization. And now the reality, as you know, is that many materials are sourced in an artisanal and informal way. 30% of the cobalt for lithium-ion batteries, that's the case. With then lack of health and safety measures, which pose major health risks to the miners, to children in many cases, or worse situation where we get conflict minerals and so on. Now, responsible minerals regulation, which we adopted in 2017, requires due diligence of the EU importers. And so we provide accompanying measures for all actors along the mineral supply chain through our European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. And we work with the private sector, we work with civil society, with national authorities, with the international donor community. And we then engage beyond that, of course, through the initiative, which you know, EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and specifically with the G7 Connects initiative in contract negotiations. So all of this to give you an idea of how, with this multi-dimensional complex set of legislative measures and the impact they have on partner countries, governance, private sector actors, we have put in place now a way in which we can mobilize the EU budget, the Global Europe budget, to actually support all those different partners to make sure that the outcomes are good, which means continued access to the EU market, but with respect of those much higher standards than what we've seen. We do this together with our member states in a Team Europe approach. It's something which we developed during COVID, working with our European development finance institutions, with our member states, so as to make sure that we clearly align much better than we ever did before our joint efforts. I will stop by just saying that and recognizing, of course, that the scale of the challenge remains enormous. And that there are, I think, a number of areas where we probably need to continue to try and do better. First of all, I think we can still improve the way in which we have these kind of strategic discussions with partner governments to really promote homegrown and international private sector activity. We have a number of very good initiatives which we are piloting. I gave the example of cacao. I think the work we're doing with Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, is extremely promising, but also showing how hard and complex a matter it is. I think these strategic discussions with the partners is really important. Secondly, I think we further need to improve our dialogue with the private sector. And for that, of course, we need to improve our knowledge of objectives, operating modalities, decision-making, and so on. And I think CSR Europe is really an extremely valuable partner for us. And finally, we need to ensure that the voice of the private sector itself, together with the civil society and with the non-governmental actors, is heard also more clearly in multilateral fora. And so I think that events like these, Jan, are for us extremely useful. And I think, as I'm sure Commissioner Reinders has said earlier this morning, that the collaboration between CSR Europe and the European Commission, is very strong and that we all hope that it will continue to grow. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Koen. And again, thank you also, Olivier. That was really rich in terms of contributions. And I must say, yes, it's really a time that we receive all this information. Just for your information to the attendees, there was also a session Tuesday, a plenary session in this summit, where Caroline Wellemans, also from DG INTA, was in a discussion, for instance, with Société Générale, looking what are the innovations in terms of financial instruments. Is it in the private sector? Is it within the European Commission? So I invite you to maybe also have a look at that. It's time for me to give the floor for the concluding remarks to Stefan Kretz. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, on the financing element, at 2 p.m., this summit has another session on financing changes in the supply chain. So you are invited to that if I stop on time. Leadership and engagement. Those are the two words that I heard a lot, especially the one on engagement. But I also wanted to emphasize leadership that is needed and leadership from companies. And we heard leadership is not about doing the right thing by yourself. Leadership is about not going alone, taking the others along, not to replicate what you are doing, but because a leader understands that even a large company cannot do it alone. The engagement part that I picked up from all the speakers almost is about going local, tackle the root cause, make sure that this law, this due diligence law, gets accompanied by a number of supporting measures for producers, but also for the capacity building. And I saw in the chat also Eva responding. It's also about the capacity building inside the companies. It's about how do key account managers, purchasing people work, etc. So this supporting measures for producers and capacity buildings by companies, by NGOs through policy changes are needed to countermeasure the risk that was highlighted that the due diligence law will bring, the risk of disengagement, the risk of increased poverty or exclusion from markets, etc. So there's a role for all. And someone mentioned the duty to collaborate, and we put it, I think, in CSR Europe in a discussion paper from the German presidency last year. And at that time, it was a little bit controversial, but now I think it's getting into the duty to respect comes together with the duty to collaborate, is what we wrote, I think, at that time. And that collaboration, we heard a lot of finance opportunities as well. Koen Doens was referring to it, but there are also the technical assistance programs. We saw some on the chat coming as well, or the direct foreign investment, etc. If those tools are oriented more to those changes, that would be very helpful. And a second, so one is capacity building, supporting measures for producers. A second accompanying measure is what I think also Eva said, the mainstreaming the sustainability as a business model, or I think another way it was said, from an extractive to an inclusive sourcing approach. And that's not easy. And I think that on the last slide we put one way forward to have this type of discussion we have now, and I think in Germany there is already GIZ, is already organizing this platform we heard from Daimler. But I think at the European level, we need these European sector alliances to foster the dialogue, but not only dialogue, to bring in all those instruments that exist, financial instruments, experience, etc., that can lead then to collaborative action. Where can we work together with Solidaridad on the cocoa supply chain, with Entreprise Générale de Congo further at a larger scale, even on the artisanal mining in Congo, etc. Let's discuss that, and I hope that the European Commission and maybe Team Europe would be interested to see, okay, let's make an alliance with a clear purpose, a clear roadmap, clear deliverables, with actions not only by companies, but also by policymakers, by NGOs, civil society, etc., that looks into this area. And I wanted to close this session with this appeal, actually, of making these sector alliances to have sure that we can have the impact at scale that we are all looking for. We are 15 minutes late. I apologize for that, but It was a rich discussion. I thank all the speakers, all the panelists, and the team also producing this webinar. And I think this was not the last time we will discuss this. I thank you very much and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.